Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway. Today I'm going to team up with you guys to try to figure out which of Hornby's engines is the best of all time. So you're probably thinking, man, that's quite an ambitious task. How on earth is he going to figure out which of Hornby's engines is the best of all time? Well, obviously, I don't think it's really possible. You can't just pick one loco and say that is the best of all time, because there are so many to choose from and it's completely subjective. Different people are going to have different opinions, but I thought it might be fun just to give it a go. So what I'm going to try and do is revisit every single one of Hornby's locos decade by decade, starting from the 1950s, and then I'm going to pick my favourite from that bunch. And then at the very end, I'm going to put all of those together and let you guys vote on which is the best. Now, I do realise there are some limitations with this approach. It is just for fun. It's not too serious. The answer, whatever it might be, isn't necessarily going to be definitive. First of all, because it's all based around my opinion. Okay, so 10 different people could do this experiment and pick different locos. Although I am going to try and be as objective as I can, so I'm not going to be just picking my favourites. I'm going to try and pick ones that I think are actually really good models. Second of all, I don't own every single model that Hornby has ever produced. I wish I did, but I don't. So this isn't going to be all inclusive. Now, don't get me wrong, I do own most of them, but unfortunately, I'm not able to spend thousands of pounds just for the sake of one video. So yeah, if I do miss out a model that you particularly like, do let me know down in the comments. The final limitation is that I don't own any Hornby Dublo locomotives. Those are the really early ones. So I'm going to be starting, well, I'm going to be starting from the 1950s, the Rovex plastics age, which to be fair is the start of Hornby proper. It's from those models that most of Hornby's locos today are derived. So we're going to start with the 1950s. Here are the engines. Quite amazing this. These are Hornby's first ever locos effectively. Not technically, but effectively. So let's take a close look at them and talk about each one. So the first one is obviously Rovex Plastics' first ever model. It is the Princess class, an absolutely monumental model. Probably the most important, but is it the best? I'm not too sure. Next up, we have the first tank engine they ever built. I think that's fair to say. It is, of course, the Ginty. Again, very important model. Then we have one of the very first diesels, the Triang Transcontinental diesel, another staple of Triang in the 1950s. And then to go along with that, you have a steamer that's also a transcontinental. That was known as the Hiawatha originally, I think. Next up, we have a real classic looking loco. This is the saddle tank. I've talked about this in recent videos. Very, very tall, of course, because it was clockwork originally, but then converted to use motors. Next along, we have a standard design. Of course, this would have been a modern loco at the time of release. It was quite a realistic model in terms of the body, but the wheel set wasn't all that great because it used standard parts. Either way, it is a standard class 3 tank engine, I believe. Next up, a real classic Triang model. It is, of course, the 08 shunter. This is not necessarily the original release, but it is based on the same tooling as the original release. Then we have a really cool model. It is the Dock shunter. Absolutely love this one. It's just so cool. So much play value to that one. Really, really love it. An absolute classic. And then finally, a really cute little tender engine. It is the Dealey 3F060. The original one was in BR black, but they later did a maroon one like this. Again, same model. So a lot of very, very special models here, all of them marking the start of Hornby's journey, really, at least in terms of plastic models. All of them very important in their own way, but I have just got to choose one. Now, what do I like the best? I don't know, maybe just the Princess. But what do I think is the best model? Well, I think it's this one. I'm going to go with the Dock shunter. Now, it is a very detailed model. There's quite a lot of painted detail and there's a few separately fitted parts. But what I love the most about this, and what I think makes this deserve to win, is the mechanism. It's just a wonderful little bit of model engineering. All-wheel drive, all-wheel pickup, such great runners. They've got lights, they're amazing for shunting. Here it is running, as you can see. Yes, it's just such a good runner. It can haul an awful lot. They're very, very powerful and just great fun to use. And really, that was the aim of Triang in those days, to be really enjoyable. And this one certainly is. So I love it. That is the Dock shunter. Let's move on then to the next decade, of course, the 1960s. I think this might be my favourite decade. We'll see. And there they are, not all, but most of Hornby's locos from the 1960s. And you can see just what a prolific year this was. So many models. The business was doing incredibly well at that time, as you can tell just by the sheer number of them. But on top of that, in my opinion, the detail of these was the best you could buy. It was far superior by this point, in my opinion, to the likes of Hornby Dublo and, other ready-to-run locos that had gone before them. Very, very impressive. So the first loco is this. This is the Britannia. Again, a very, very impressive model. Quite complex for the time. Probably the most detailed at the time that one was released at the start of the 1960s. Next up we have the L1. Quite an unusual choice, but really glad they did it nonetheless. It's a lovely 440. Next up one you will all recognise because it's still produced today, to this day, from the 1960s. It is of course the Dean single, Lord of the Isles there. Beautiful, beautiful model. Next up we have the 040, the first 040 tank engine. The original one was Nelly from the 1960s, but I've got a different Caledonian, I think it is one. Again though, a very, very important model. They sold absolutely thousands of them, really did. Next up we have the Battle of Britain class, or West Country, whatever you want to call it. Winston Churchill, a very important model once again. Very detailed, absolutely incredible looking, as you can tell. Love those to bits. Next up, again, these are all really important models, still produced up until very recently in the 2000s. The B12, the first one I think was the BR Black one, but again, they made many, many different variations of this over time. Very detailed, it must be said, for the 1960s. Yet another classic one coming up, it is the Caledonian single, which used the same chassis as the Dean single. Again, produced until reasonably recently actually, and very, very nicely done for the time as well. Next up, an instantly recognisable model. It is the Blue Pullman. Again, this was just such a lovely model. It had all the table lamps and everything, loads of detail and matching coaches, of course, and they produced loads of different versions of these over the years. You've definitely seen one if you've been in this hobby for long enough. Same really with the next one. This is the Class 31, made loads and loads of these in different liveries. Really good models actually, quite a nice mechanism on this. This used their sort of spider design, which was quite interesting but very successful. Next up, yet another 040 tank engine. I'm not going to show all of these, by the way, because Hornby have made hundreds and hundreds over the years. But this is another quite nice design, as you can see. Looks a bit different to the original one. But again, hundreds of them made. Next up, one of the most detailed we've seen so far. It is the Hall class. As you can see, really, really lovely. One of the first Great Western 460s ever made by Hornby. And there it is right there. Of course, there were castles available at the time from Wren or Hornby Dublo. But this was the first one done in plastic. Next up we have yet another classic model. This did get a retool at one point, but this is the original one. It's the High Mech, of course, same mechanism as the Class 31. Again, really, really impressive model. And then we have some of my favourites at the back. Another Southern one here. This is the M7, a very strange wheel configuration, a bit like the L1, a strange choice, but a really, really good choice in my opinion. It's a 044 tank engine, love that. Next up, an absolute classic, probably the most important of the bunch. It is the original Flying Scotsman. The original was actually BR Green, I think it was, but this is based on the same model. Yes, it's the same one that James May had with the realistic chuffing sound. They sold probably hundreds of thousands of those, a very, very popular model indeed. And then finally, the cherry on top, it is the Stephenson's Rocket, just a superb model for the time. It really, really is. So as you can see, yeah, so many contenders in the 1960s, all of them really, really impressive. It's a toss-up for me between several models. I really like Lord of the Isles, really, really beautiful model, and the fact that it lasted so long is a testament to how good that one was. Obviously, I love the West Country class or the Battle of Britain, fantastic models, love those to bits. I do love the Hall class, I think that was fantastic. The Scotsman, as I've said, is the most important and it's really one of the best. However, I do think the winner has to be this one. It has to be Stephenson's Rocket for me, because it was, in my opinion at least, the most complex loco that Triang had produced up until that point. Yes, it's complex in terms of all the separately fitted parts, of which there are very, very many, but the technology required to make something like this run in those days was just amazing. Such a tiny motor in there, and yes, by modern standards, they're not very good runners, but they did run, and they did run pretty well at the time. And for that, I think this one just has to win it. Look at the intricacy there. It actually looks quite modern compared to some of the others just because of how much detail was on that one. Yep, I could be wrong, but in my opinion, this is the best. It's the most detailed and the most impressive in my opinion. And there it goes. As you can see, it still works all these years on. Absolutely wonderful. I love these things. And as you can tell, mine's not a terrible runner. It can't crawl or anything like that, but I've added pickups and improved it slightly, and it certainly does race along. Yeah, Stephenson's Rocket. What a lovely model. Okay, let's move on then to the next decade, the 1970s. So here we are then in the 1970s, and as you can see, it was another good decade for Hornby. Lots and lots of new models, many of them made possible by a brand new innovation which occurred very early on in the 1970s, and that was of course the Ringfield motor. Now these days the Ringfield motor isn't revered particularly, most people aren't a huge fan, but it did serve Hornby for a good 30, maybe even 40 years, and so a lot of the models you're going to see from this decade did have it. So the first one is, I believe, the first example to use the Hornby Ringfield motor. It is the 9F, and there's so much you could say about this. The first thing ought to be that this is a more modern version. It does use the same tooling, but this is a modern produced version that is loco driven. The original version was a massive technical challenge. How do you drive that many wheels and not have the thing derailing on tight curves, etc, etc? Well, it was this loco that caused them to actually innovate the Ringfield motor. In the tender, it was a really powerful thing, and amazingly the model did run on tight radius curves. What an amazing innovation that was. Next up we have the Coronation class, what I would consider to be possibly the most beautiful loco from this decade. It did reuse a chassis. I think it uses the same chassis as the Flying Scotsman, but obviously it looks completely different because it has the Coronation body on. Next up, the first pannier tank. As you can see, this was a really nice pannier. It used the same chassis that a lot of the 060s before it did. As you can see, nice shiny finish. A lot of locos from the 70s were made with a gloss finish, which is great. Next up, a Black 5, the next model I believe to use the Ringfield motor. Again, quite nice and modern looking. Mine is a modern version, but it uses the same tooling I believe. Produced up until very recently, just like the 9F is as well. But like the 9F, this is now loco driven, but it didn't used to be. Next up we have the first 2P. This was a bit of a cop-out really because it used the same chassis as the L1 and the body was designed to fit, so it didn't really have the best proportions, but I guess I quite like it. Next up we have the IVAT 2MT, and again, what a beautiful model this one was. Quite detailed, lots of valve gear going on with this. Yeah, a beauty. Lots and lots of those produced. Next up, another model that was using the Ringfield motor. I believe this is the Class 47. I'm not 100% sure whether mine is an ex-Hornby or an ex-Lima or not. I'm not sure about that, but either way, yep, they did have one and it did use the Ringfield, I believe. Next up, another loco to utilise the 060 chassis. It is the J83, a lovely little LNER 060 tank engine there. Again, very nicely detailed. Next up, possibly the most detailed we've seen so far, it is the N15 Sir Dinadan. Again, a nice glossy finish to this one, loads of separately fitted metal parts, lots of painting, and this one even had nameplates on it, which were sort of printed foil. Very strange, but it did work reasonably well. Next up, yet another loco you might recognise. It's still produced today in train sets, the Santa's Express for instance. It's the Holden 101 tank, I believe it is. Again, mine's a modern reproduction of the same model, but yep, 1970s is when it first surfaced. Next up, a very ubiquitous model, both in model form and in real life. It is the Class 25, or RAT, yet another contender for the Ringfield motor. Very nicely detailed and produced once again for many, many years. Next up on the back row we have a new Ginty. They retooled the Ginty in the 1970s, and I believe that is the same as the one that they produced today. So once again, huge longevity with this model. Still around today, mine's a modern version. Next up, one of my favourite diesels, it is the Class 29. Again, beautiful detail, separately fitted handrails, cab details, lots and lots of moulding. Yeah, a really, really nice model, that one. Next up, a real classic, it is the A4. The first A4s were tender driven, and as you can see, a very detailed model, once again, separately fitted handrails, etc, etc. Not the same as is produced today, of course, they did retool it, but yeah, nonetheless, it was good for the time. Next up, one you will all recognise, it is the E2. I believe this used a different chassis at long last to the old sort of Triang X04 chassis. They still use the same motors initially, but yes, it was an updated chassis to use a standardised body. And obviously it's a very important model because it later became Thomas, but no, originally it was the LBSC E2. Next up we have the Patriot. Once again, just like the Black 5, it did use the Ringfield motor originally. I believe the body of this one is pretty much original, maybe not from the 70s, but early on, but the chassis is a modern one. And then finally, possibly the most numerously produced Hornby model of all time. I don't have any stats on that, but it's got to be one of them, hasn't it? It is the Intercity 125 HST. How many of these were produced and sold, I have no idea, but it's thousands and thousands and thousands, isn't it? Okay, so, my goodness, where do we even start? So many amazing models here. Obviously, Evening Star is phenomenal. The Coronation class was phenomenal. The Black 5 produced for many, many years, very nicely detailed. The Class 47, same thing goes with that. The Class 29 was very impressive. The Ginty, one of the most detailed models produced until that time. The A4, very much so as well. Loads of them were very impressive. But I think for its pure technical innovation, it has to have been the 9F. And the fact that it's still being produced to this day is amazing, isn't it? It has been changed a little bit over time, but it's still an amazing model, and it was at the time. It was so detailed, all those separately fitted parts. I believe the handrails may have been even separately fitted when it was new. Incredibly powerful, and of course the first ever loco to use the Ringfield motor, which I think has to count for something. So there we go. As you can see, they're still going strong. I unfortunately don't have an original 9F with the Ringfield motor. I have serviced them before. They're quite interesting. The very first Ringfield motor looks quite a lot different to the, well, later developments of the Ringfield, but it still ran very well, and for that I think it deserves to be admired. So there we go, what I consider the best loco of the 1970s from Hornby. So we're creeping ever closer to the present day. Let's jump into the 1980s then and see what that decade holds. Alright, so there we have it, the locos of the 1980s, and as you can see the number is still pretty healthy, quite a lot of locos from the 80s. However, if I had to choose one of the decades that was my least favourite, I think it could be this one. No major upgrades in terms of the level of detail. There were minor ones, but not an awful lot to speak of. One thing that I'm not a huge fan of is the number of tender-driven locomotives. Basically, all of the tender locos were tender-driven. Now, for some tender locos, the 9F for instance, it made sense, because to try and drive that massive wheel set could have generated some reliability issues, but I think Hornby realised that they could produce the same mechanism regardless of the loco and save money that way, and I do think a lot of these would have been better had they been loco drive, as they are these days. But either way, let's get to the list then. So first one's the Caledonian Pug. Again, still produced today. Mine's a slightly more modern version. Quite an impressive model, very detailed, and it also had a die-cast running board, which was a great quality feature for the time. Next up we have the 2721 pannier tank, one of the final locos to be fitted with the XO3 XO4 motor, at least originally. They're not produced with it these days of course. Once again, a relatively nicely detailed loco for the time. Just like the next one that you might be familiar with if you've watched some of my more recent reviews, it is the Fowler 4P tank, a very, very impressive model, very well detailed. The early mechanism wasn't that reliable. A lot of people actually, since I reviewed my modern one, said that they have old versions of this that have broken down or are unreliable, such and such. I believe this was probably the last XO4 or XO3 driven model to be produced. I could be wrong, but of the ones I own, I believe that's it. Next up we have the B17, mine's a modern railroad one, but it uses the same body as the 80s version. Again, originally that was tender driven, which was a shame because loads and loads of space inside the loco for a motor of course. Next up we have the first of the 440s that Hornby produced in the 1980s, and no doubt you'll recognise these because they're still produced today in the railroad range. So we have the Midland compound, which is absolutely beautiful, very, very detailed. In fact, it is a shame about the mechanism. Next up we have the D49, which is very similar. It uses basically the same chassis on loco and tender, although I think the wheel spacing for some of the 440s is a bit different. Again, very, very nicely detailed. Then we have a county class. Mine is a more modern railroad one, but these were originally made in the 1980s. Again, same story really, well detailed, tender driven. And finally, the schools class. That is the final of the quartet really of 440s that Hornby produced. Very nicely detailed, probably the best of the lot in fact, but once again tender driven. Next up, another tank engine. Now I think this might have been the first one to use the Type M motor, or did the original have the XO4, XO3? I'm not too sure about that. If you've got a 1980s version, please let me know. Incredibly well detailed, beautifully modelled. It came with cab crew, that sort of thing. Just a really, really fantastic model. Definitely one of my favourites. Next up we have the Intercity Class 86. Really, really nice this one. Again, 1980s Ringfield drive. Quite nicely detailed because of the pantograph, of course. Yes, quite an impressive model, that one. Next up we have a Class 58, which I believe was too thin to house the Ringfield motor. It was known as the bone because it was thin in the middle. And so Hornby devised their own sort of mechanism, once again using that Type 7 motor. It was notoriously prone to failure. I've had them blow up on me in the past. Not very good runners. Well, they are good runners, but they're not reliable, unfortunately. But well detailed, of course. Then we have the 110 DMU. This is the first proper DMU I've actually showed you, although Trying did produce some, but I don't own any. Again, nicely detailed, but not the best in the world in terms of performance. Okay, though. Then we have the hideous pacer, or what a lot of people would consider to be hideous pacers. Yet again, using that Type M motor, this is really when they became quite prolific, as we've seen quite a few models already have used them. But they're alright models, they're well detailed and they did run well, it must be said. Next up we have the 8F. This was a very impressive model, very large, quite detailed. Mine's a more modern version. Mine's actually loco driven, but originally they were tender drive. Yeah, not the best in the world in terms of performance, yet again because of the Ringfield motor, but good models nonetheless. And then we have the Intercity Class 90 and Class 91. I think mine's a 91, but they did those as well. Not the same as the 125, it was a different model, and that one came along just towards the end of the 1980s. So we've got a few contenders here. I mean, in terms of innovation, I would say maybe the Caledonian Pug has it because of the die-cast running plate. That's really good. In terms of detail, I would say maybe the 4P's got it because it's just so beautiful, although mine's a more modern version. The old ones weren't quite that good. But I think the best all-rounder for me has to be the J13. Maybe I'm being biased because mine's a more modern version with a nicer livery. But I just think in terms of character, in terms of performance, the Type M motor does run well, it must be said. Yeah, I think it's a good all-rounder, good runner, nicely detailed, and absolutely beautiful, of course. So there we have it, the J13 up and running. Of course, they did make LNER versions of this. The original one might have been LNER, so they did have different classifications, but mine is a J13, of course. So there you have it, a really, really lovely engine, and that is my top pick for the 1980s. Like I say, there could be other models that I don't own, which were better than this, but in my opinion, this one's probably the best. Okay, let's get on to the 1990s, which is a slightly disappointing but quite interesting decade. So the 1990s was a bit of an uninspiring year for Hornby in my opinion, and the main reason for that I think is due to one large event which took place in the 1990s. Basically Dapol, you mostly know Dapol these days, they used to be quite a big presence in 00 scale. Well, at some point during the 1990s they decided that they could no longer compete against the likes of Hornby, and they decided to withdraw from the 00 gauge market. And Hornby purchased a lot of their models, they purchased a lot of the toolings, and I assume that they spent most of their sort of development budget on buying these toolings because they produced very, very few locos during the 1990s. Most of what you see here, in fact all but one, were all ex-Dapol locos, and it wouldn't be until the early sort of 2000s when Hornby would start changing them and updating the mechanisms and such. I think during the 90s they mostly just were re-released just as Dapol had produced them. So the only actual Hornby loco I could find in my entire collection, there may be more, but the only one I could actually find was this, the 2800 class. So it's a very decent model, lots of separately fitted parts, and it had quite a few exciting gimmicks. It had a smoke generator and it had a light inside the firebox. But besides that, yeah, it was okay. It was just reasonably well detailed, and of course it was tender driven, but not too bad. The rest of the locos are all ex-Dapol ones, and they're very good. I think they're more detailed than Hornby were at the time. So we'll go through them quickly, although of course, strictly speaking, these are not Hornby. So we have the 14XX, which is still more or less in the range today. Next up we have the Castle class. As you can see, mine's Hogwarts Castle, but obviously it wouldn't have been in the 1990s because Hornby weren't time travellers as far as I'm aware, and they couldn't have seen the Harry Potter movies before the early 2000s, but yeah, they did have the Castle class. Then we have the 4F, used to be tender driven, now loco driven of course. Then we have the L&YR Pug, one of the classic Hornby locos, which did actually originate from Dapol. Same thing with the J94, very well detailed, incredibly so. I believe they even had sprung buffers back in the Dapol days, in fact. Yes, much more detailed than the likes of Hornby. The 2P, again, a very nicely detailed model. Dapol were really good at 00 gauge, it seems, back in the 80s when most of these were produced. But no, Hornby started making those in the 90s. Same with this is a big diesel, a Class 56. Silly models really, because the gearing makes them run so incredibly fast, it's almost crazy. But the level of detail is fantastic, probably better than what we'd seen from Hornby in the past. Next up is the loco I would probably choose as the best of the decade, had it not been an ex-Dapol loco. It is the Terrier, of course, very nicely detailed for the time, and Hornby continued to produce those models for many, many years. And then finally we have the County class, another Great Western 460, beautifully detailed. Hornby sure took it up and carried on producing it, and it was converted to loco drive. It might have always been loco drive, I'm not sure, but yeah, either way they took it. Well, no surprises here. The loco I picked for this decade has got to be the 2800 class because it's the only true Hornby model of the decade. I don't think I could rightly put a Dapol loco into Hornby's top locos of all time. It just wouldn't really make sense, would it? So the 2800 class, yeah, it's not my favourite model so far by a long way. Obviously I'm not that much of a fan of the tender drive, but it was a decent model, lots of metal on it, lots of detail, and a fair runner. So as you can see, there it is, pulling some goods. Still works just fine. Mine was produced back in the 1990s. Of course they did retool it, and we'll see that in just a second. But that's the original version, and that has to be, by default, the best model for me from Hornby in the 1990s. If you know of any other 1990s models that you think were better than this, do make it known down in the comments. For now though, let's move on to Hornby's golden age, as considered by many, the 2000s. So here we are then in the 2000s, and for me this is Hornby's best decade from the 1960s. The change from the 90s to the 2000s was just incredible. So we've got Loco Drive again. All of Hornby's new releases were Loco Drive. The level of detail just went through the ceiling. They must have spent an absolute fortune on all of the new toolings over this decade. And as you can see, they're not just little tank engines and piddly little models. A lot of them are huge Pacifics, and it's a really good job they spent what they did during the 2000s, because obviously during their financial decline in the next decade, they were able to fall back on these models and continue to sell them, obviously, and the sheer high standards of these models made them desirable, and a lot of them still are today. So let's take a look at some of them then. The first two are left over from Dapol, so we have the Large Prairie there, which Hornby re-engineered slightly, I think, to include a different motor. Ex-Airfix originally. Same things with the N2 as well. Hornby changed it to have a slightly better motor, but it dated back to the 70s, I think, so it is quite an old loco. But again, it was part of the deal with Dapol/Airfix, or whatever you want to call it. Next up then, we have the first of the brand new toured locos. Absolutely incredible, this one, the Merchant Navy class. Loco drive, so much detail, the first of Hornby's super detailed models, I would say. To go along with it, they also did a unrebuilt Battle of Britain/West Country class. Here's mine. Again, just the level of detail was unlike anything we'd seen before. If you cast your mind back even to the 90s, compare this to the 2800 class, yeah, completely different. Another huge Pacific up next, the Coronation class. They made loads of different versions of these. Now been retooled again, of course, in the 2010s, but this was the first super detailed one. It was even the correct length, unlike the Triang one. Very impressive stuff. Same with the next loco, the Q1, possibly one of my personal favourites, just an incredibly well detailed model. The fine scale pipework and all of the separately fitted parts was just unprecedented when this was released. Very, very impressive. Next up, the Princess. I've talked about this in great detail over previous videos, but yeah, this was first introduced in the early 2000s. Next up, we have the A1s and A3s, which Hornby re-released. Absolutely incredible models, really, really are. Still produced today, more or less. Loads and loads of detail to those and fantastic mechanisms. Same thing with a similarly great mechanism. They also released A4s as well, brand new tooled, not the same as the 1980s versions, or was it 70s? I forget now. Yeah, absolutely incredible. Once again, still produced to this day, I believe. Next up, a Grange. This is the first of a new generation of Hornby 460s. Many, many more to follow, of course, but this was the first super detailed one, and very good it was as well. Then we have a Duchess class, the unstreamlined version of the Coronation. Again, just a very, very impressive model. Lots and lots of detail on those. Once again, they have been retooled more recently, but even these were fantastic. Next up, a tank engine, back in the range for the first time since goodness knows when, the M7, of course. Yep, Triang did it, but this was an all-new retool, and the level of detail was just out of this world on that. I hope Hornby can continue to produce that. Wonderful it is. Next up, we have an N15, possibly one of the most detailed locos of the decade. Really, really impressive, that one. A beautiful Southern 460, unprecedented level of details with that. Next up, we have the Stania 4P. It's very similar to the Fowler, but it's much more detailed, much more modern. Just as good a runner, though. Next up, we have the T9. These were impressive because they had die-cast boilers, I believe, which was really nice. Again, a lot of detail. These were quite fragile models because some of the pipework was a little bit flimsy. It was probably the start of the poor quality phase, as some people like to call it. But overall, beautiful models. Same with the Schools class. That's the next one. Brand new Schools class, not the same as the old 80s tender-driven ones. Die-cast body, loads and loads of detail. Once again, to a fault. These did have a few quality problems with Mazak rot and other sort of details coming off them, but the detail was definitely there. And then I think one of the last models of the decade was this, the Castle class. Superb level of detail, absolutely incredible. That is a real contender for my favourite of the decade, or what I think is the best. Now, it's incredibly difficult to decide because I love the Merchant Navy, I love the Battle of Britons, I love the Q1, I love the A1s, A3s, I love the A4s. They're all amazing. I love the N15. There's very few that I don't like, but I've had to pick one to represent them all, and I think the best has to be this. This is the A1 or A3, whatever you want to call it. I think they did both, didn't they? Mine's book law, as you can see. I believe it's an A3, is it? And yeah, the beauty of this model is just incredible. They did an amazing job with this. Let me know in the comments if you'd pick a different loco from the 2000s, but for me, it has to be this one. Just look at that. Okay, one more complete decade still to do, and there's an awful lot to see during that one, so let's get to it. So the 2010s, the decade just passed, seems to be easily the most prolific year for Hornby. A whole multitude of brand new models, most of them absolutely amazing. They very much maintained the standard set in the early 2000s. For the most part, in some models the standards did slip very slightly, and I will point those out to you. Obviously, I'm not going to be going over all of these in a lot of detail just because there are so many, but let's go through them and have a quick look. So we have an updated 2800 class, beautiful level of detail. We have a B17, an LNER B17, nice and new. An L1 tank, widely considered to be one of the best Hornby tank engines produced. It really is very good. Then we have a brand new B1, again super detailed, really nice paintwork, etc, etc. Then we get on to what was called the design clever phase. Essentially what that meant is that Hornby decided to sell cheap, low detailed models at pretty high prices, and safe to say it didn't work and they don't do it anymore. But we have the P2, probably one of the best of the picks, not a bad model that, but quite basic for what it cost. We have the Duke of Gloucester, again not a very nice model, particularly mechanically, these two. Yeah, they suffered a little bit with some poor quality. The Tornado, once again beautiful models, really well built, but quite basic for what they cost. And then the Hall class, which ended up just going straight into the railroad range. I don't think they dared put it in the main range, but again it was similar in terms of detail. And then we have the 72XX, again a really basic model for what it cost. Not a huge fan of those, but they are massive, as you can tell, and quite cool to see. Then we had the tiny model craze, which I really love. So we have the little Sentinel shunter there. Then we have the Ruston shunter, the very smallest of them all, very impressive that. We have the B2 Peckett, which was impressive because it was largely die-cast, just like the W4 was here, which again was the 040 version, but very good quality. Over here we have the J50, what I would consider probably Hornby's best tank engine to date, really good quality, that one. Then we have the more recent Terrier, as you can see, again nicely detailed. An electric here, class 71, a very nicely detailed electric, great run of that one. And then the H class, again this one had a lot of problems with the motor, poor choice of motor, but generally speaking beautiful models and really reasonably priced those. At the back we have the Drummond 700 class, a really nice loco, that one, very similar to the T9 in terms of level of detail. The B12, an absolutely superb model. It's just the perfect design in my opinion. Beautifully detailed metal boiler, amazingly engineered mechanism, absolutely astonishing. The same is true for the D16, that's the next one. It's very similar to the B12, but it's a 440. Again, die-cast boiler, very impressive. Lord Nelson, not the best in the world, very light in fact for its size. Not a bad puller, nicely detailed, but a bit overpriced I thought. Next up is the Thompson 01. This was a reasonably basic model, but very inexpensive to buy, and pretty well detailed for what it cost. I think if Design Clever had been more like that, it would have been more of a success. Then we have the J36, again a beautiful bit of engineering there for a reasonable price. Die-cast boiler, lovely mechanism, very good indeed. King class, one of the most detailed models ever in my opinion, very good. The Star class, very similar in terms of its level of detail, quite an impressive one that. Then we have the Q6, the Raven Q6, very basic model in my opinion, bit of a Design Clever-esque theme going on with that, but good looking and good running nonetheless. S15, quite similar to the N15, but it is a different tooling, I believe. Again, very nicely detailed, decent runners. The Hornby K1 is next, really nice and heavy, that one, well detailed. Doesn't stand out really from the crowd, but it is a good model, I would say. Then we have the J15 again, just an incredible little model, metal mostly, beautiful mechanism, really good. And then finally the standard class 4, which again is one of the most detailed models of the lot. It's just impossible, isn't it? It's impossible to choose so many fantastic models. I really like the 2800 class, the Pecketts, the Rustons, really good. The H class was beautiful. I love the D16, J36 Maud, really wonderful. The King class, one of the better detailed locos I've ever seen. Yeah, they're all just superb, but the one I choose is this. It is the Hornby B12. You just can't beat it. Let me show you this one running. So it weighs a ton, it really does. It's made of metal, mostly the boiler. The mechanism is just beautiful. 5-pole motor, all-wheel pickup, proper bearings on the wheel set. It's just so nice to service, and it looks amazing as well. It's one of the most detailed models ever. I absolutely love it. So there you have it then, folks, what I consider to be the best model from each decade, and I can't believe I've never done this before, but that was an awful lot of fun. So have a close look, think about which one you're going to pick, and then we will get on to the polls and you guys get to vote. Okay, had a good look? Ready? Okay, let's finish this. Okay, so you've seen them all now, what I consider to be the best model, the best Hornby model from each decade. So this is where you come in, this is your job now. I'm going to put them all into a poll. Obviously I can only have 5 answers per poll, so I'm going to have to do 2. Here comes the first one now, that has the first 5 locos in it. Now, only vote in one poll, okay, if you can help it. Only make one vote, because obviously you're choosing your favourite, so there are going to be 2 polls, just choose one. Okay, let's put the second one up then. There we go, that's the final. Is it 3? I'm not 100% sure of the number actually. Okay, cool, thank you very much for that. So I will count those up, I'll give you a few weeks to do it, and then hopefully in the next live stream we will discover which of Hornby's locos is the best of all time, at least according to us. Maybe others would disagree. So thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed looking back over Hornby's history. I really did actually, absolutely fascinating. I love doing this stuff. I hope you did as well. So thank you very much for watching. You take care, and I'll see you very, very soon. All right, cheers everybody.